Well, good morning. Good to have everyone here this morning. If you could take a seat, we'll go ahead and get started. Josh, could you do the roll call for us this morning?
Rachel Arizmendi. Present. Ashley Bourne. Don Bransford. Don Cameron.
Here.
Nancy Cassidy. Here. Helene Dillard. Ben Drake. Mike Gallo. Here. Crystal Haling. Here. Eric Holst. Bryce Lundberg. Here. Martha Montoya. Joyce Sterling. Here. Andy Thulin. Here. Mr. President, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Josh. If you'll join me, we'll stand for the flag salute. Well, thank you, and it's always good to see a good attendance in the audience here. I'd like to begin by thanking Joy and her family for hosting us at our last board meeting. So it was absolutely excellent, and so thank you, Joy.
It was really our pleasure, and I hope it's just the first of many visits.
Thank you. Secretary Ross will be joining us shortly, but we're going to go ahead and move to our first presentation. I apologize. We need to approve our minutes from our last meeting. We have a second? Any discussion?
I'll need a motion for each for the January 31st and February 1st. So Mike Gallo and Rachel for the very first.
Okay, do we have any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? So moved. Okay, we need a motion for the...
Mike moves to the first.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? So moved. Okay. Our topic this morning is going to be California Invasive Species and the Advisory Committee. We have John Kabashima with UC Cooperative Extension. John serves as an Emeritus Environmental Horticultural Advisor for UC A&R's Cooperative Extension Office in Orange County. John was instrumental in bringing together a statewide invasive pest summit in January this year and also helped set priorities to prevent invasive pest threats. John will be discussing both the summit and his work with the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. John?
Thank you very much. So on January 11th and 12th, we had a California Invasive Species Summit. And this was held at the state capitol, and it was attended by quite a broad spectrum of people. And basically, the way I got involved is I came to an Invasive Species Advisory Council meeting, and I was introduced to this document. It's Stopping the Spread, and it's an Invasive Species Action Plan, and it was approved by the Invasive Species Council of California on August 2nd of 2011, and all the secretaries are assignees on the document. And this document was prepared by the California Invasive Species Advisory Committee. So the summit was to take this document that was developed in 2011 and to bring it into the 21st century. Because between 2011 and 2018, a lot of things happened. So the goals of the summit were to identify actions in the strategic framework report that should be priorities for implementation, to identify agencies, stakeholders, resources that can be coordinated to implement the priority actions, and to identify challenges to the implementation of the priority actions, including funding sources, personnel authority, and potential solutions to overcoming those challenges. So the summit was, I should also say, co-sponsored by the University of California Division of Agricultural and Natural Resources and the California Invasive Species International Society of Boriculture, the Western chapter, and CAL FIRE. And there was a pretty diverse group that attended that meeting, from scientists to nonprofit organizations, and it represented anything from agriculture to residential neighborhoods and the urban forest, which, by the way, is one of the critical pathways that needed to be incorporated into the 21st century plan. We had a keynote from Secretary Ross, and the VP, Glenda Humiston of the University of California of Ag and Natural Resources, welcomed the attendees to the meeting. And the program, basically, in a nutshell, we had an overview of how we got here, how the strategic framework was developed. Dave Pagos and Doug Johnson did a good job on that one. Then we had invasive species case studies. And invasive shot-hole borers were an example of the insect taxa, insect disease complex, and the nutria were talked about from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife perspective as a vertebrate pest. And then Dr. Irina Irvine from the National Park Service talked about yellow star thistle as an example of an invasive weed species. Then we had breakout sessions, and there were 2 days of breakout sessions. The first one covered taxa, so we broke out into little groups and talked about terrestrial plants and algae, aquatic plants and algae, vertebrates, arthropods, mollusks, and diseases. And the second day, we talked about pathways in these breakout sessions, and we had recreation, pet trade, horticulture, plant industry, transportation, and the internet and international trade and tourism. After we had these breakout groups, we came together as a group, and we basically listed all of the actions that all the breakout groups came up with. I'm not expecting to be able to read this, by the way. I just want to, in case you know me, a lot of people who know me don't believe I'm telling the truth, so I have to always put writing on papers to show. It could have been X's if I made it a little bit smaller. But anyway, we identified key actions and did a dot exercise where basically everything was put up on the walls, not permanently affixed because it was the Capitol. And we had dots, and people would put dots on the different actions that they felt were really important. So some of the key strategies were increasing funding, funding emergency, rapid response, funding weed management, and et cetera. I think one of the ones that I really wanted to emphasize, and I think maybe it was on the previous page, is to fund the Invasive Species Council of California and codify it, and also the California Invasive Species Advisory Committee, so that they could actually have a working body with funding to coordinate statewide of many of these actions that we listed. And by the way, the strategic framework document is available. There are 46 actions in that document. And to implement that would take a coordinated body that's dedicated to that process. So what's come out of this? We're currently putting together all the actions and comments from the summit. Stephanie Lucero from Cal State Sacramento is working on that as we speak. That is being funded, the printing of that will be funded by UCANR. And so the proceedings of the summit will be available and there'll be addendums to the strategic framework to create the 21st century invasive species document. From that summit, one of the reasons we had it at the state capitol is to encourage legislative staff to attend, and we were very successful. So we had Stephen Stensler from Assemblyman Grayson's office was there, and Ryan Greenlaw was there from Ledge Council, and as were other staff from other assembly members' offices. And Assemblyman Grayson has agreed to author AB 2470, and Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher's office is authoring Assembly Bill 2054. 2054 specifically addresses the invasive shot-hole borers, which are devastating trees in Southern California. Over 60 families of trees, millions of trees are at risk. In California, I think 171 million trees are at risk. Many of them are very important riparian trees for endangered species and the urban forest. AB 2470 is actually a bill that takes the recommendations from the summit, and so that is a multiple agency bill to fund the Invasive Species Council of California and the Invasive Species Advisory Committee and other things such as research. I think there was a big stipend for Secretary Ross in there. Oh, I'm sorry, Karen, I didn't see you walked in. And so that bill is very comprehensive. I think it's a good start towards addressing the new threats that we're facing in California. And one thing I would mention is a good example would be the glassy-winged sharpshooter and how it built up to tremendous numbers and was vectoring Xylella fastidiosa Pierce's disease in Southern California. And because it wasn't deemed an agricultural threat, built up to tremendous numbers, and then, Ben Drake exploded into Temecula, and that highlighted the importance of the urban forest as an urban incubator for many of these pests to build up to tremendous numbers to allow them then to become threats to agriculture. And so this bill will help to address that, but it'll address the various taxa and pathways. And you need this comprehensive approach in order to do that. So those two bills are currently been sponsored. And there's a third one that I don't know too much about, but I thought I would mention it because I keep hearing about it, AB 2166 by Assemblywoman Ana Caballero. And that's the California Farm Bill. So something to keep an eye on. I'm sure others have much more information on that than I do, but it's really exciting that during this session we have 3 assembly bills that are addressing very important issues. And I think for the Board of Agriculture, these have directly impacted agriculture in California and will continue to in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll open it up to questions.
I got one last thing.
Oh,
I
go
always
right ahead.
forget this. Everybody says I do this. This is the planning committee, and I just want to, when you, I know it's amazing, right, Karen? The membership on this board went across agencies, nonprofits, the universities, all worked very hard on this conference. We were actually having weekly conference calls, and then the main committee was also meeting weekly or conference calling weekly to put this conference together. And I especially want to give a shout out to Stephanie Lucero from Cal State Sacramento because she kept us on task, and for David Pagels for being her little lackey. So she would tell him what to do, and he would implement it. Just absolutely stunning. Okay, so thank you.
Great. Thank you, John.
Is that a promotion for David, or?
We were supposed to talk about, I was supposed to talk to you in a sidebar later, Karen.
John, I really appreciate your presentation. We were wondering, how do other states implement these types of programs? Do you have similar programs in neighboring states that help prevent pests from reaching California?
Yes, in fact, there is a federally funded collaboration it's a TriState Collaboration between Florida, Hawaii, and California. And those are the 3 states that have a great deal of trade and tourism. So they're very similar to us in terms of having an ideal climate, having a large population of both urban and agriculture. And we face very similar problems. So the Florida entryways are from one part of the world. Hawaii is kind of a central little island, little ecosystem of itself. I've been spending quite a bit of time in Hawaii because somebody has to do it. And they are being inundated with pests. And when I spoke at their conference in December, and I mentioned the list of 67 reproductive hosts for the shot-hole borers and Fusarium dieback, they saw one tree on that list. It was the acacia. And if you ever go to Hawaii and you go to the shops and you buy the koa, anything made of koa wood, that's acacia. And when I put that chart up there and I had acacia bold-faced, you could hear the audience gasp. And they're currently fighting quite a few things. They have a coconut rhinoceros beetle right now. They came in from probably Guam, and they have ohia. It's a fungus that's attacking their ohia trees. Their whole island is just under attack by invasives, and they were here last year to visit, and they toured the shot-hole borer infested areas, and they are scared to death of this, getting over there. And they toured the South American palm weevil in the Mexican border, San Diego region, and that is outright killing canary and palm trees in just a matter of months. And some of those trees, like in Orange County, some of our palm trees are worth about $40,000 each. And I'm surprised at where I see palm trees all over California. And when this South American palm weevil gets going, it's going to devastate the palms in California. And this AB 2470, I think, is a really good step towards helping to develop some way of either slowing that, mitigating it. I'm not sure you can eradicate it because it flies across the border from Mexico. Oh, and then emerald ash borer. So that's a disaster. That's just like crazy. It's just going through the areas of the United States and wiping out ash trees. But Florida, California, and Hawaii are the three that are really concerned right now. And they are trying to educate people nationally in Congress and in their states about the need for collaboration between the three states.
Yep, Crystal?
I'm just curious if you can quantify roughly what percent of this challenge with most of these invasives has to do with climate change and the areas here being more amenable to some of these pests versus just purely because the pests have been introduced either through travel or through trade or other things like that. Is there any way that you could give a sense of that?
Well, I can just kind of give you a rough idea that the scientists have identified that this is happening, and if you're a farmer, you're seeing the impacts on your farm. If you're in any of the the entomology or plant pathology areas, we're seeing things move. Things are changing. Patterns that we had kind of depended on for many decades are changing. And so climate change is definitely going to have a major impact. A recent study at UC Riverside on the biology of the shot-hole borers and the Fusarium dieback is that it can go all the way up to Tehama County and across the Central Valley. And with climate change, when people say, oh, it's too cold in Northern California, it's changing. And as it changes, they will be able to more successfully invade larger areas. So indeed, climate change is a fact. And there are quite a few papers out on that, but that's just a body of research that's continuing to this day.
Thank you, John. Impressive group you have there, and fabulous collaboration and cooperation and inclusiveness in the discussions. 46 action items? Did I get that right?
Oh, yes.
How many did you have? Was it 46?
Yeah.
That's impressive. John, I was wondering who is responsible for, ultimately, when there's invasive species in California, is it a centralized responsibility, or is it decentralized? I see all the folks up here, and there's many county representatives and representatives from various parts of California, as would be essential, but are invasive species handled regionally, or is there a central authority that has ultimate responsibility?
Well, at the risk of being corrected by people in the audience, and I'm going to purposely keep my back to them so I don't see them when I make a mistake. But, you know, basically, there are agencies like the USDA APHIS, and they basically deal with external threats to the United States, and they do quite an awesome job with the resources they have. And I always couch terms in terms of resources they have, because nobody has all the resources they want. But with what they have, I think they do a stellar job of trying to keep things out of the United States. But when you listen to them talk, and the sheer numbers of things that come in on airplanes and ships and people carrying things in, is just staggering. And so I think that's the first line of defense. And then once something does get in that it's on their radar, then they can enact a quarantine. And with that quarantine comes regulatory authority and funding and rapid response and survey. A whole slew of things come into play. And it's much like fires. They have all of these agencies that respond to emergencies have what they call an incident command structure. So just like think about a wildfire. We have the same structure for invasive pests. So USDA, APHIS is at the front of that. And then the next level that works in partnership with USDA is the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And so if it's a agriculturally significant pest, then, and the USDA has a quarantine, then USDA and CDFA work hand in hand in that ICS system, and they coordinate and bring in authority and resources to deal with it. Oftentimes I'll get involved when they want a scientific technical committee to give our opinion on what we see, and they have their own information from studies they've done of the pest in the other areas or from their past experience. Once something becomes established in an area and a little bit widespread, say in a county, then there's a process where they reevaluate the rating of that pest. They have a rating system, Q, A, B, C, and when things come in, and especially if they don't know exactly the significance of it, it's a Q-rated pest, and then an A-rated pest. Once it becomes established in an area, then they may downrate it to a B-rated pest. And at that point in time, usually, and Helene, am I correct, USDA will step back on B-rated pests? Yeah. And then CDFA and the agricultural commissioners really become important on B-rated pests, because then it's up to the local agricultural commissioner's discretion of how they might regulate that pest. Because it's not quarantined by USDA or CDFA, and so the ag commissioner can enact some type of action depending on their concern and their funding. And then when it becomes really well established and widespread, it'll be downrated to a C pest. Now the one thing that always gets regulated in all of this, because I know you're going to ask the question, is the nursery industry. And so the nursery industry will always be regulated because they move plants across the nation, across state lines and county lines. So whenever something gets downrated to a C pest, that doesn't mean everybody ignores it. It becomes, in the nursery trade, it becomes regulated because they must be commercially clean in order to ship plants. Is that a good answer, Karen?
That's pretty thorough. I do want to point out that California, I've often said that part of our valuable infrastructure in California that's unique is the county agricultural commissioner system, and having that very local entity there is something that we have that no other state has. And they're certainly a partner with us in USDA in our programs.
And that was, in December, was emphasized to me over and over by the Hawaii Department of Ag, is how envious they are of our agricultural commissioner system. And that's one of the reasons they're struggling much more than we do, because they don't have that ag commissioner system to work with. And the ag commissioner systems, depending on the county, their funding changes. So many of the counties have, like Orange County, have de-emphasized agriculture as it's become more urban. And yet, it's an important pathway for agricultural pests. So it's a conundrum. And part of this is one of the things that came up in the discussions was to provide some funding for agricultural commissioners to help them deal with these invasive pests.
Yeah, Bryce, you got a follow-up?
Well, the follow-up would just be, thank you for that explanation, John. Do we have the tools to manage invasive pests for the 21st century? Just the magnitude and the kind of the explosion of issues, and do we have the tools? I think related to what Crystal brought up, just with the changing climate, do we have the tools, and do we have what's necessary to win?
So I'm going to say this as a retired university person so that I don't get chastised by the university. I believe we do. You know, our science has leapfrogged. You know, the technologies we have today and the level of knowledge that we're at compared to, you know, decades ago, they have, I think, kept up. And I believe that. I've watched USDA and CDFA set up their ICS systems with various pests, and when they have the resources, they do the best job in the world, in my opinion. When they don't have the resources, they can't. So my feeling is it's not so much climate change and this is going to get so big that we can't deal with it. My feeling is that we have the expertise, the technology, the resources. We have the ICS structure that I think, if properly funded, could really do quite a good job of preventing much of the damage that these things might cause in the future. You know, one of the problems we're having today is we're struggling with funding to deal with these new pests that are coming in that, unlike my prior years in the university, we are running into more and more invasive pests that are unidentified, unknown to science. And so in the old days, it was a small world. There were fewer people, fewer pests moving around. And we knew when something might come in. We knew a lot about its biology and how to deal with it. And now we're running into things that no one's seen. We have to find an expert who can identify it. We have to have researchers get funding to try to study the biology. And by the way, where it comes from, the behaviors may be totally different than the behaviors here, because we do have very unique microclimates. We have the invasive shothole borers came to the United States, and they did not see any of its native host material here. And it came and was presented with all the species of trees that we have here. And our environment is unique in the world. We have everything here. So when that beetle came here, it basically was landing on trees, trying to figure out if it could bore into the trees and grow its fungus in its tunnels. It feeds on the fungus kills the tree. So they're trying to see if the fungus would grow on a tree, and then it would make its galleries and make babies, and then they would get the fungus in their mouth parts and fly off to another tree and infect it. So, you know, we have that challenge, and that's going to take funding in order to have the experts ready to identify something, study its biology, see what it's doing here as opposed to its country of origin, and then dealing with the potential for the climate change, changing the climate enough in California that we create more habitat for these pests. Whereas in the past, when I started out working for the Ag Commissioner in LA County, a Japanese beetle would land in an airplane at LAX and it would fly out and die because LAX was surrounded by nothing. And now when it flies off from LAX, there's lush landscapes with every kind of plant material in the world. And so these things have, you know, a much better chance of establishing. But then we've successfully for 40 years kept Japanese beetle from establishing in Southern California because of our plan, our protocols to mitigate and trap it and control it when we find it. I mean, I know we can do it. It's just do we have the resources to do it?
Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
John, thank you so much for all of your work on the issues. I guess going back to the summit, I guess was there any discussion or findings in terms of like public engagement on issues?
Absolutely.
And then what was kind of the takeaway?
That was one of the action items that came out of the summit, is that we need to fund outreach and education with the public. And we need to work with a cross-section of collaborators to reach all those little niches. You know, when you think about the tremendous amount of information that's been generated on shot hole borers. I mean, LA Times, Orange County Register, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, ABC News, NPR. And then I run into people every day who's never heard of it. So we realize that's something that's going to take money to get into those areas where we're not reaching. And, you know, a lot of it's social media. How do you reach those people? My daughter doesn't read a newspaper. She gets everything on her phone, social media. And that's an identified action in our summit proceedings. And we say that there should be funds allocated for that.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Appreciate all the work you do.
You're welcome.
At this time, I'd like to have Secretary Ross give us a departmental update.
Good morning. My apologies for being late. I was speaking to California Farm Bureau, is one of many organizations this week that's in town for Ledge Day. And so I'm on my tour of the last time I get to do X this year. And then someone took my parking place this morning, so I had to come right away. Bad car. I'm just going to run through a few things. I'm assuming we've already touched on the PEIR and that we can't talk, okay, we can't really. We have a challenge to the programmatic EIR, which was prepared 7 years ago as a way to be more transparent and provide the public information about all of our pest programs. That's been going through a challenge for several years now, and we've had a recent decision that will hamper some of the activities, but we're working through it. We're doing an analysis of what our options are, and we are considering an appeal. So there's a lot of things we won't be able to talk about with regard to that today because of the ongoing potential litigation. But there's a lot of other things going on across the department. And I wanted to start with the federal milk marketing orders, since our favorite dairyman is here today. There was a court decision that could impact the level of a staff member or an administrative law judge being able to conduct hearings, which there was a 7-week hearing 2 years ago for the federal milk marketing order proposal. And the Supreme Court will be hearing a case on this. It affects many agencies, not just USDA. And USDA did find what they think is a reasonable path forward with having an appropriate officer review the record and either concur with that or do any potential updates for that. So they're still on track to have the federal milk marketing order proposal out for a vote sometime this year, and they're hoping for the summer. So that's a big development because that's been 3 years for our dairy industry of making a proposal to USDA. Throughout the agency, we have a lot of programs that are being implemented. One of the big ones is the first legislation of its kind in the country, which was passed 2 years ago, SB 27, which deals with changing any use of antibiotics of human medical importance that are being administered to livestock must be done under prescription by a veterinarian and dispensed by specified outlets for that. Our team's done a good job from the beginning of doing stakeholder collaboration on that, and we have regulations ready to go. That's been a big, big, big process. We also have, that's in our animal health division, over in inspection services, they have the contract with Food and Drug Administration for state implementation on the Food Safety Modernization Act. We've created an environmental audit unit that will be the boots on the ground for that. This year, as according to the strategic plan that we submitted to FDA for our funding, a lot of this year is about education, outreach, and farm readiness reviews with our farmers so they know what the audits will be like, what to expect in that process. And we're just preparing to put out another $450,000 for technical assistance and workshops that any NGO or commodity organization can apply for. That's a big undertaking here at CDFA. I'm also pleased to announce that at the end of last year, FDA deemed that the changes that the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement had made to their metrics for their audit system were in alignment with the Food Safety Modernization Act and its criteria. That's a big deal because that's thousands of farms that are already going through an audit process. And so to have that deemed to be an alliance gives us, which is good because we're the state that has the most farms. We have 20,000 farms that we think are covered by this, so it's a big undertaking. We are in the process right now of putting out lots of requests for proposals on grants under the Climate Change Investment Fund. We have a request for proposals for technical assistance for our Healthy Soils program. There will be one more round of about $1.5 million for funds for healthy soils for the farmers to apply for, so watch for that in the near future. We have a request for proposals out for technical assistance for alternative manure management practices. There'll be another round of funding for that. We are in the process of soliciting proposals for our dairy digester program. That deadline for that particular round closed 2 weeks ago. We had 74 or 75 proposals. So a lot of interest in that. And it's been very exciting to see this opportunity for cow power to run trucks and vehicles up and down 99 and I-5, and that would be really good for our air quality as well as reducing greenhouse gases. So there's a lot going on in that regard. And then just today, we also published a request for proposals. We were provided through the legislature last year $250,000 for small dairy climate research. So there's another request for proposals out on that. This week is the annual celebration of Weights and Measures Week. This is one of my favorites because there's usually a nice potluck or barbecue out of the Division of Weights and Measures, and there was on Friday. I love this little division because they're doing so much for the new economy. They have to set the standards for biofuels. They worked with alternative ride carriers to come up with a computer system that would measure the rides on a consistent basis. The hydrogen fuel dispensers are all type of things that we do. But also, it's very interesting for me that the very first function of government when the United States government was formed was weights and measures to make sure that consumers were getting what they paid for and that all businesses were operating on the same platform. And I have to go to Paris to find the original weight. That's my goal before I'm gone. It's somewhere in Paris. And then, of course, one of our other new programs deals with cannabis and the implementation of the regulations for that. We started our licensing on January 1st. We have a little less, the last count I saw, a little less than 4,000 applications. As of a week ago, we have 2,000 licenses that have been issued under the temporary license criteria. We've had right around 1,000 rejections. Usually that's because local government does not yet have its own rules in place, and that's been the major reason for rejecting any applications, because you have to have state and local government authority. And we're just getting ready to start the work on establishing organic standards, organic-like standards, and appellations for the cannabis program. And then our other big division is our pest division, and you're getting ready to hear about that. So I don't think there's anything for me to add to that. And we're preparing for a climate summit later this year in San Francisco in September. Yeah. Is that it? And Ag Day. Thank you, Rachel. And Rachel, because I've missed a couple of board meetings, have you been introduced to the board this year? Well, our newest assistant secretary, she hit the ground running so well that we feel like she's been around forever. Rachel O'Brien, we're thrilled to have her join us. She started at the first of the year. And literally, we are very lucky because she's very familiar with CDFA and a lot of our programs. She was the manager of regulatory and government affairs over at the Agricultural Council of California. She started out in the Capitol and then went off and did some environmental work, and then she was at the Ag Council, and now we have her, and she's doing a great job on all of our legislative issues. And so, and she's also our liaison for the cannabis program. So, did I forget anything? How many bills are we tracking? A bunch, huh? Yeah. Yes, it is a busy year. So we're thrilled to have Rachel on our staff. And for those of you who missed the announcement 2 weeks ago, Jenny Lester Moffitt is our new sworn-in undersecretary. So it's only a coincidence that the secretary, the undersecretary, and the assistant secretary are women.
Thank you very much, Secretary Ross. And I had the opportunity to meet Rachel about a month ago, so welcome aboard, and congratulations to Jenny Lester Moffitt, too. Yeah, go ahead, Bryce.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
Well, thank you for the references to Weights and Measure. What a balanced organization.
I knew I could count on you.
I was just wondering, Secretary Ross, have you tracked at all the term regenerative organic? I went to the Ecological Farming Conference. It was referenced there, and I believe there's when the USDA first implemented organic, the NOSB and I think many others said there is only one organic, and that is USDA organic, and you cannot reference it being a higher or lower standard than organic. But that was 2000, and we're at 2018. Do you have any thoughts on that, or should we discuss that with the California Organic Food Advisory Board? Or what's your thoughts on that?
So this is an area I get a little bit frustrated in. We tend to throw out a new term practically every couple of years, which I think is very confusing for our public. So I get a little bit frustrated with, let's have a new term because we want to be able to convey something new and better is usually how it's positioned. And I think it's kind of like using the word sustainable. It's about a place and time, but it's not a forever thing. It's constantly, agriculture is constantly changing and adapting. So I get very concerned about trying to lock in a consumer's mind, it's one thing and it stays that way, because agriculture is not that way. It's biology, and we're constantly looking at improvements and adapting to things. So I get worried about bringing in yet another term that adds another layer of, well, what are farmers really doing? It is very much about building soil, which organic is about building soil, which any farmer is about how do I optimize yields and quality and have the soil health to make sure I can do this every year and every generation. So I'm watching it and would hope that we don't let it be yet another way of dividing ag about one kind of ag versus another kind of ag. This is a very long answer, but I think we all are involved in this, and we can't let ourselves divide ourselves up because there's a few farmers and a lot of consumers, and consumers get there's a lot out there. How do they pick and choose
Well, in
and know
2000, I
what's
think
good?
USDA said there will be one organic, and there will not be CCOF organic, and there will not be OCIA organic, and there will not be NOFA organic. There will be one organic. And I was just wondering if you know if there's been a change at
No.
USDA
No,
to allow for a regenerative organic
I
certification?
think what you're seeing is in the marketplace, there are, and I'll just use the proliferation of certified free from gluten, free from antibiotics, free from, you can list a long list of free from, and that is driven by market and organizations that start up around a particular issue. It's not necessarily a USDA. USDA has one organic, and I'm not aware of a specific proposal, well, I should take this back. The National Organic Standards Board at their meeting in Denver, where there was a huge discussion about grown in the soil or using alternative mediums, which for a lot of new beginning farmers and urban farming is going to be the way for them to do it. And maybe that's where some of this is coming from too. But there's a very strong movement for regenerative agriculture, people trying to convey something more. And that's where I see us just splitting ourselves up. And we need to be connected with our consumers and open and transparent about the practices we use and be able to answer their questions. And now it's my turn. I did not know that you played the ukulele and that you did a very fine rendition. I knew I wanted to go to the NACWA meeting last week because of the program. Had I known that you were going to do your own version of Imagine on the ukulele. So I would really invite you at any point to grab the microphone and give us your version.
So who was your, okay.
I'm just saying I came here from the Farm Bureau meeting.
So Secretary, could you just spend a few more minutes on the healthy soils process? We're in the budget, are we in the bond?
So the proposed expenditure plan, which was released at the 1st of February, includes $5 million for healthy soils. The SB 5, which is Water and Parks Bond, includes $18 million for the on-farm water use efficiency sweep, and it includes 5 or 10. I'm looking at Rachel. My brain is not working. I think it's $10 million, or is it $5 million? $7.5 million. Sorry, it's around 10, and I'm in government. That's close enough. It's around, I think it's slightly less than $10 million for, my apologies to all of my colleagues in government. I have huge respect for you. I think it's less than $10 million is also in the bond. There are many members of the legislature who are interested in making sure that the ongoing expenditure plan includes sweep, which was not in the one that was proposed, as well as a more robust number for the healthy soils. So I think there'll be, the governor proposes and the legislature will go through the hearing process. So it's yet to be determined what the final number will be for this year's budget and expenditure plan. But the bond does include both of those programs.
Thank you very much, Secretary Ross. We'll go ahead and move on. We have a panel, California Invasive Pest Update. Stephen Brown, Division of Plant Health and Pest Prevention Services. Nick Condos, Citrus Disease and Pest Prevention Program. And Roger Spencer, Pierce Disease Control Program. If you guys would like to come forward, and we'll begin our panel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Brown, the Interim Director for Plant, and I was going to do a little presentation on exotic fruit flies and other pests in California. And how do I get next slide? There we go. So the first thing I want to start off with is that we've got about 14 detection surveys that we routinely do. And probably you haven't heard about most of these because we usually don't find pests. So the ones where we do find pests are exotic fruit flies, the light brown apple moth, glassy winged sharpshooter, and Asian citruscillid and HLB, which Nick will address. So although I've listed sort of 14 here, it's really much more than that because under the exotic fruit flies, we look for at least a dozen species of genus species of fruit flies. And the same thing on the exotic wood borers. It's a generic trap which can trap a lot of different species of exotic wood borers. Next, I wanted to just sort of go into our MedFly preventive release program. And primarily I want to talk about this because it's a cooperative program between us and the USDA, and it's a proactive versus reactive approach. And then the other huge thing is that we'll get into in just a moment is this serves as a platform for our launching our exotic fruit fly projects, or SIT projects, sterile insect technique projects in California. So again, we're using sterile flies. We have a rearing facility in Hawaii that produces about 150 million pupa a week. And then we also draw on the USDA rearing facility in Guatemala. And that's a purchase as needed. Typically what we do is if we're going to have a downtime at our Hawaiian lab, or when we get into eradication programs for fruit flies, we have to draw on the USDA's Guatemalan facility. I don't know that we need to get into the details of the release. We have the program is in Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino. And since the implementation of this program, we've had a 93% reduction in infestations. So this is visual on the area that we're doing our work in. And in some areas, we're sort of challenged because we have an ideal height that we'd like to release at. And when you start encountering air traffic controllers in multiple airports, you have to either adjust up or down where you're going to release. And so sometimes it's harder to get the flies exactly where you want them to be. Okay, so this is our 2017 through February detections. We had MedFly, Mexican fruit fly, Caribbean fruit fly, guava fruit fly, melon, Oriental fruit fly, peach fly, and Mediterranean fruit fly projects. By far, the county that gets them all is Los Angeles. So the only thing they didn't get was Mexican fruit fly. And the only county that got Mexican fruit fly was San Diego County. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And the Bactrocera group, which is the Oriental fruit fly group, that typically is our most widespread found fruit fly in California. You can see it's in a number of counties, and it's one that we end up with the most delimitation and eradication projects for. The MedFly, we were unlucky enough to have 3 MedFly infestations in California, and I'll go on to that a little bit on the next slide. So we had 31 delimitation-only projects, and what a delimitation-only project is intensive trapping. And that's the first stage of our eradication efforts. Then we had 8 actually ongoing eradication projects, 2 for Mexican fruit fly, 4 for Oriental fruit fly, and 3 for MedFly. As far as quarantines, we had 5 quarantines, 1 for Mexican fruit fly, 1 for Oriental fruit fly, and 3 for MedFly. Having 3 separate quarantines for MedFly is extremely unusual for us. The Oriental fruit fly quarantine was terminated on January 17th, so that one's over with. So I've listed the treatment methods, and basically it's a sterile insect technique for Mexican fruit fly and for MedFly. That technique is not available for doing Oriental fruit fly. And generally speaking, our treatments are with the organic spinosad, and that's called Naturalite, and that's a 200-meter radius. And when we have multiple either adults found on a property or larvae or a mated female, we do host fruit removal. And this last season, we only had to do host fruit removal for the Mediterranean fruit fly. So where do we compare? Well, we got good news and bad news. So as far as flies, we're above our normal average. And as far as species, we're at the top of what we normally get in a year. Eradication projects, we're down by 2. Quarantines, we're up by 2. Delimitation, we're up by 9. And one of the things we started tracking that I think is very interesting is that we've doubled the fines that are in our Northern California Central Valley area for 2017. I think this is reflecting the change of the urban agricultural interfaces, that we're getting this population that's coming in, and so it's increasing the threat to the agriculture in those areas. Let's see. Oh, I want to shift gears now this is a very successful program that we had, which was for European grapevine moth. It could only be achieved a successful eradication because of the cooperation and the really heavy lift that our industry did by doing vineyard treatments and mating disruption. So as you can see, we've declared eradication in 2016, even though we hadn't had any moths found since 2015. And we'll go into an ongoing detection program for that this season. Gypsy moth, we were unfortunate enough to get 1 European gypsy moth and 1 Asian male gypsy moth detected in Santa Cruz County. We don't really like to have any pest fines in Santa Cruz County. It's not a good place for us to be. The difference between the Asian and the European moths is that the Asian female moth has the ability to fly long distances and lay eggs, and the European female has to crawl. So it really changes your strategy as far as detection. Japanese beetle, we had 3 adults that were trapped in the environment, 1 in Fair Oaks in Sacramento, 1 in Hawaiian Gardens in Los Angeles, and 1 in Goleta in Santa Barbara County. That's another place we don't like to be. We've got 51 adults trapped in high hazard traps at airports and freight forwarding facilities. And these are facilities that we know they get shipments from the East and Midwest from high risk areas. And so we have a 25 traps per square mile grid around them to try to keep them from escaping out of those facilities when they do come in. The thing that was most alarming for last year was that we found Japanese beetle on 403 aircraft originating from JB infested states. And that's the number of aircraft. The actual number of JB found was a little bit over 800 that were found. It's the worst year that we've ever had, and we've expressed our concern to the USDA. And that's all I have.
So, Stephen, I think a little bit of background. We have some people who are very new to the committee. I think it would be helpful to understand what quarantines do. And I also think there's a big interplay here between the disruption to our natural environment and that some of these pests are, in fact, oftentimes in urban areas and have a direct impact, like shot-hole borer, on the urban tree canopy, and understanding where there's this kind of interplay. I think it's really important.
Correct. That would really be the case for the European and Asian gypsy moths and for Japanese beetle. Those are both things that are going to really impact the urban canopy and probably are likely going to be more of a problem for our forested areas with the gypsy moth and in the homeowners and residents for Japanese beetle. So while they're going to be agricultural pests too, I think the greatest impacts would be to our urban environment for those 2 pests. And the purpose of a quarantine is really to prevent the artificial spread of the pest. And for most quarantines, we have what is a parallel eradication project. So many of our quarantines prevent the movement of host commodities either within the regulated area or from the regulated area. And the reason for preventing it within the regulated area is because you don't want to push those exotic fruit flies or whatever it is to the edge of the quarantine and then have that expand the quarantine and unnecessarily impact other people. Anybody have any other questions on that?
Stephen, where did your funding come from? Is it local, federal, or?
It's a blend. It's a blend, except we don't get local. We give some local, but it's either general fund or USDA. And in recent years, we've gotten a lot more USDA funding for our projects, and we're very thankful for that.
And I think we should acknowledge Helene Wright, who has been with USDA APHIS, and she has been a terrific partner here in the state. So, Helene, thanks for being here today.
Yes, the counties have their general fund, and to get their portion of the gas tax fund that they also get, which is prorated on a formula basis, they have to maintain their general fund support for the pest detection and quarantine stuff that they actually do as far as doing the inspections that are quarantine related. So when commodities come in and they're subject to quarantine inspections, that's an activity that's being done by the counties, and they do it through a high-risk program, which targets high-risk pathways. They have dog teams, which do inspections at express facilities and also at the post office. And they're able to target unmarked packages and find prohibited ag commodities that way. Yes.
Yep. Go ahead, Nancy.
Is there a formula for extrapolating if you find one, how many others?
Well, there really isn't. There's a formula for what happens if you don't take action and how you get an exponential growth. But that's one of the things is that we're not really in control of the environment as far as what comes in or when it comes in. And then since when you get an eradication project for fruit flies, we start treating at 2. Okay, and so we may be knocking, and since we use, like on the Oriental fruit fly, since we use a male attracting techniques, what that means is that you're preferentially knocking down those males, and so you're not going to be trapping them because you're killing them. So you can't, it's one of those things that's very difficult. And, years ago we tried to do performance measures on this, and we found that you couldn't do it because it's something that you're not in control of.
Joy?
You said, first of all, thank you for all this great information. You said that you were going to USDA to try to cut down on the number of pests coming in on airplanes. What could they do?
Well, USDA has a program where they regulate airports, and so that's one of the areas that they can be active in. Last year, as background, for the first time we had Amazon flights coming into California directly. And I think it caught everybody by surprise, and it was done under contract, and it was very hard to get a handle on. And those Amazon flights started going into smaller airports. For instance, they were going into Stockton. And we actually had 11 live Japanese beetles trapped in an agricultural field that was bordering the Stockton airport. So that's one of the areas that we reach out. There is a national Japanese beetle coordination committee that has participants from the states and also from the USDA.
Thank you. I had a few questions. I don't know if I'll just first. It's just kind of a quickie. When you talk about a sterile fruit fly program, is that both male and female, or do you just have one?
It's preferentially males. Okay. We typically have less than 1% females in that population, and so the whole goal is to have those sterile males mating with the females, and they only mate once. And that takes them out of the reproductive cycle.
When it comes to fruit fly, would you characterize it as management, control, or eradication, or all of the above?
Currently, except for the olive fruit fly, every single exotic fruit fly that's been introduced into California has been eradicated.
When it comes to quarantine, how would you characterize the financial implications to farmers when there's a quarantine?
Well, it really depends upon the targeted quarantine pests. MedFly would have a broad host range for anybody that's growing host fruit crops, stuff like that. If you get to peach fruit fly, there's less host fruit crops. There is the direct impacts of having to have your product certified if you're located within a quarantine area. However, if we do not do those quarantine activities and conduct that program, then under federal regulations, they would regulate the whole state. So while there is a local impact, it protects the larger good.
Josh?
Steve, I think it would be helpful if you can kind of give maybe an example for the board in terms of, sorry if this is an unfair question, in terms of like some cost for pests. Like for European grapevine moth, for instance, you mentioned there's 44,000 traps that were placed out for obviously a number of years. What's kind of the cost for that kind of program, kind of ballpark for the board?
In a ballpark, we're looking for the detection, the intensive effort, about $6 million. But of course, when we had the actual projects in the 10 counties, it was much higher than that. But right now, ongoing, it's about 6.2, I think. Is that correct?
So ongoing for a pest that we do not currently haven't detected, correct? That's been declared eradicated. We're still spending that amount of money for
That's
just
correct.
the trapping side of it.
Yes. And this was something that came out of the, was it the technical working group? Yes. So USDA has a technical working group, and because European grapevine moth can remain hidden in very small, isolated pockets, that they wanted to maintain that intensive trapping to ensure that we actually had eradicated.
How many years do you have to go before you can officially confirm the pest is gone?
Well, we think we did that in 2016, and how many years they're going to want to maintain this intensive trapping, that remains to be seen.
Right. Then you can always have a reintroduction too.
And we can always have a reintroduction, yeah.
Kind of a follow-up, and maybe it's after the panel is kind of completed, but in regards to funding, since funding is always an issue for all the key programs, is there ability to say, we're spending $6 million on this pest for trapping, for instance. Is there the ability to fluctuate that funding in terms of how we prioritize? Or is it kind of?
Well, it's pretty consistent if we want to hit what we want to hit. Our farm bill funding is what, usually around 6 million when you combine everything? Okay. What? 10 or 12. Ooh, I was way off.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate what you do. It protects all of our farming throughout the state here.
One last question.
Oh, sorry, Bryce.
Is there a significant difference between plant pests and insect pests as far as the programs? And are they done out of the same offices or different offices? And so I'm in a quarantine level for or I'm in a quarantine area for a plant pest. And of course, our area wanted to try to keep that quarantine from being elevated to a higher level. But so far, there are not that big of implications to the quarantine on the plant pests other than where you pull seed from and things like that. But any significant differences or where they're managed?
Well, like for light brown apple moth, we have individual quarantine areas within the state. Then we have a contiguous quarantine area within the state. Within that contiguous area, because it's so large and encompasses the whole central portion of the state, coastal portion of the state, we allow the movement within that area of light brown apple moth host material, but you don't let it move out of that area. And then in the smaller quarantine areas that are not contiguous, the movement within and out is both regulated. Is that an example of something you?
Well, I was more wondering if there's a difference between invasive plants and invasive insects.
Oh, invasive plant pests.
And where they're working. I mean, I think we're focusing mostly on insects today, but are they handled out of the same offices?
Yes. However, we haven't really have a weed program since 2011.
You're referring to what, the winged water primrose issues?
Ah.
Your local county ag
Correct.
But the mechanisms of the quarantine work the same regardless of whether it's a plant or an insect or a disease.
So on quarantine pests, typically when we have A's and B's, you may have state involvement. When you get down into C's, it's going to be local discretion. I don't know what water primrose was rated at. Do you remember? Because it has a B means that it has a limited distribution within California.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So I assume, Nick, welcome.
I'd like to thank the board for spending an entire day speaking about invasive species. It's been our livelihood here, trying to protect California and the United States from them. Currently, I am the interim director of the Citrus Pest and Disease Prevention Program. We're primarily focused on the Asian citrus psyllid and the deadly disease that it vectors, Huang Long Bing. Just a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with those two, Asian citrus psyllid is a very small bug that primarily feeds on citrus plants and its related species. And it vectors a bacteria that is fatal to citrus plants. So it's not just about damaging fruit, it's about killing plants that produce, important food. And I want to, before I start, kind of go back and answer a question that John should have answered better. He tap danced around, he wouldn't look me in the face, but you asked the question about who's responsible. Well, is it a specific entity or is it everybody? Well, the answer is yes and yes. At the ultimate levels, the USDA and CDFA and the county ag commissioners have the primary responsibility for implementing the state's pest prevention system to keep pests out, to detect them when they get in, to respond in whatever manner is appropriate, to manage or eradicate or control them. But a lot of it depends upon who's being affected by that pest and what can be done about that pest. As part of the statewide effort to identify who's responsible, we sort of actually mapped out the pest prevention system in California to try and identify all the entities at every level, federal, state, local, and NGOs, to figure out, okay, who's responsible for what and who has what source of funding, to try and figure out and try to match up those entities that have funding and some concern about certain specific pests with those that have the authority to do something about them. Because in a lot of cases, you have NGOs or private landowners or large land management agencies that have funding, but they don't have the broad authority to deal with them. So it was sort of an effort to try to connect all the dots and figure out how we could use the existing funding streams and authorities and where they intersect throughout all these different types of pest projects. But a lot of pests, they pick on the wrong commodity. John was given a good example of a pest that sort of spread out its damage and really no one entity take ownership over it, because that's very important. If you've got a pest, and you'll hear it from me and you'll hear it from Roger, that picks on one genus and you pick the wrong genus, then that commodity group has the ultimate responsibility for doing something about it. Nobody else is really going to step up and take the lead for them. And if you pick on a genus that has a big enough industry behind it, well, typically something is going to happen. They'll be able to organize better, assess themselves better, to pay for whatever action needs to be taken. That was a good example that started with the Pierce's disease and glassy wing sharpshooter program, and it's kind of being replicated here with the citrus pest and disease prevention program. So this is a big program. It has many of the elements of the state's pest prevention system. We have a detection system for ACP, a survey system to detect the disease, HLB, a very robust diagnostic capacity to be able to find HLB. We process tens of thousands of psyllids and plant samples every year at our diagnostic lab. In any given year, we have about 48,000 sticky yellow panel traps hanging in citrus trees throughout California, waiting for an Asian citrusilla to fly in so we can figure out where they're distributed throughout the state. The surveying for HLB involves going on to properties and looking at the citrus trees for symptoms. And last year, we visited 71,000 sites in our hunt for HLB. We also have a treatment program in order to manage and control Asian citrusilla populations in key areas, and primarily those are in areas where we're trying to protect commercial citrus from populations around them in cooperation with the growers. The growers will do a time treatment and we'll treat in residential areas around them to provide sort of a buffer of control. And along the border with Mexico, HLB exists in Mexico as well as does in limited patches in California. So we want to create a barrier of control along the border to keep the potentially HLB infected psyllids from just moving right into California. We also have intensive treatments around areas where we find HLB, because we don't want those psyllids that could potentially be carrying the disease and vectoring it away from the known infected trees to be doing that. So we have an intensive treatment program around those areas. We also have a very robust award-winning biocontrol program. I just won an award from the Department of Pesticide Regulation. And that was started because obviously we can't treat for the psyllid everywhere. So where we're not treating, we have these biocontrol agents that are always working 24/7. They're always out there working. That's free pest control from the sky, wherever these things are established. When we do find HLB, we eradicate the infested tree. And that's a very labor-intensive hunt for HLB wherever we find it. Primarily at this juncture, we've only found it in the urban and residential areas of Los Angeles, Orange, and Riverside County. Quarantine. Stephen sort of gave you a primer on the quarantine. Well, for this one, quarantine is proved very effective at containing the artificial movement, and especially specific quarantine actions have seemed to have provided a very good result. There was a question about, do we know what the effect of climate change has been on these pest populations? Well, but a year ago, 2 years ago now, we had increasing populations of the pests in the San Joaquin Valley. And Bakersfield was chock full of ACP and all into the citrus belt. And simultaneously, the industry, at least the bulk citrus industry, imposed upon themselves a requirement that they had to tarp every single load of bulk citrus moving from the grove to the packing shed in order to keep the Asian citrusilla from hitchhiking along the route, and especially citrus coming from Southern California into the valley. Well, that was implemented almost simultaneously with our miracle drought-busting winter, where the psyllid populations went down in the San Joaquin Valley. And because there were two potential causes, we don't know really which one it was. It could have been the environment, wet year, tamping down on population, but it could have been actually the voluntary and very costly quarantine actions that the industry bore the brunt of the cost of complying with that. So it kind of touches both issues. And outreach. If you don't have the cooperation of residents and the industry because they don't know what's going on, your program goes nowhere. So we have a very robust outreach program. The industry funds about a little over a third of, well, actually almost half of the cost of this program. So helping them understand where their money is going and what it's doing and how it's trying to help meet the goal of the program is very important. Most of this program is delivered in residential areas throughout the state. So ensuring that the residents understand the potential damage that ACP and HLB can do is very important. And what we find is, especially in areas of Southern California, 60% of residents have at least one citrus tree on their property. It's a very important genus for homeowners. And a lot of people have very fond connections to their citrus trees. So helping them understand the consequence of if HOB was to become established and widespread, and what they can do, and how, and the need to cooperate with our program activities, is that we spend a lot of time and a lot of money on outreach. And environmental compliance. Treatments are a big part of controlling the spread of ACP, and we have very thorough environmental compliance policies in place to ensure that our treatments can be conducted with the utmost sensitivity and effectiveness. I don't know if I mentioned, but this year we have a $41 million budget. And it's a combination of federal funds, about $14 million in federal funds, about $16 million in industry assessment funds. They're assessing themselves to pay for this program, and a one-time, although we're hoping to make it more than one time, increment of $10 million of state general fund. And it is a program that has grown quite a bit over the last couple years, not just the budget, but the volume of activity and the volume of work. And there's a lot of partners involved with this. The industry has an advisory group called the Citrus Pest and Disease Prevention Committee, and we've got a couple of the representatives here. They'll be on the panel later. And it's composed of basically growers and nurserymen and packing shed representatives. So from a variety of areas throughout the state. And they provide recommendations on what the program should be doing and the funding elements to the secretary. We've also got USDA, the primary partner, and there's two entities there. Their regulatory agency, APHIS, and their research entity, the ARS. Obviously, the county ag commissioners couldn't do what we do without them. The Citrus Research Board, we're actually very lucky that there's a specific research board dedicated to researching citrus pests and diseases and a wide variety of other things. So they've been very proactive and a great partner in our fight against ACP and HOB. Obviously, the University of California doing a lot of research, both applied and experimental. And then we have the trade organizations, Citrus Mutual, California Citrus Quality Council, Sunkist, the California Association of Nurseries and Garden Centers, and the Citrus Nursery Society. Nurseries have also been fairly well impacted by this pest and disease complex mostly because of the quarantine. We restrict the movement of citrus nursery stock around the state, and that has a definite impact on those businesses. We also have some government partners, state government partners. Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment provides anyone in our treatment areas independent information about the treatment products that we use and how we apply them. We also work very cooperatively with Department of Fish and Wildlife. We consult with them on threatened and endangered species issues in the area that we're treating, and Department of Pesticide Regulation. They are a regulating agency, but they assist us quite a bit with any questions about pesticides that come our way. So we have a lot of partners in this fight. And I probably didn't mention them all, and I apologize for those that I didn't. Some of the big issues lately, over the last several years, so we originally detected ACP in 2008, and that was in San Diego, and it slowly spread north. 2 years later, we found a big infestation in Los Angeles County, and even though we had quarantines in place, the bug is very small and it moves in a wide variety of manners. But we slowed its spread down considerably, but we had a series of large contiguous areas under quarantine and then non-contiguous small satellite quarantine areas. It was getting to be a very large and unwieldy quarantine. So in January, we implemented emergency regulation that we'd actually been working on for quite some time to sort of compartmentalize the state and restrict the movement of host material within these discrete areas. And we came up with two ways to do that. One for the movement of bulk citrus, because bulk citrus and nursery stock move in different ways. There's different patterns to where they move. So we felt it best to regulate them separately and carve the state up into these zones so that any movement between the zones, you'd have to implement mitigations to be able to safely move that commodity between the zones. So this is an example of the 7 zones for bulk citrus movement throughout the state. And anywhere they go in the state, they have to be tarped. But to move between the zones, you have to do a pre-shipment mitigation. And here's an example of the nursery restrictions. Basically 3 parts of the state. The more heavily infested areas in Southern California, the more lightly infested areas along the Central Coast and San Joaquin Valley, and then the uninfested portions of Northern California. But we went overnight from a patchwork of quarantines of about 63 square thousand miles to 87 square when we started regulating at this regional level, entire counties or small portions thereof at a regional level in order to provide a more stable quarantine system. Because before that, the quarantines were constantly expanding. It was getting very difficult to figure out if you were in one or outside of one, and now it's much more understandable, and the rules don't change quite as frequently. Sort of a historical look at how many HLB detections we've had. And as I mentioned, we found ACP for the first time in 2008, but we found the disease for the first time in 2012 in Los Angeles County. And for several years, we only had 1 infected tree. And then in 2015, we found a few more. And in 2016, even more, we found 30. Last year, unfortunately, we started to hit the curve of the infestation where it really starts to go parallel to the x-axis, unfortunately. And in many other countries around the world, this was kind of the pattern. First you get the bug, and then eventually the bug finds the disease, and then the inoculum level starts to go up, and the infestation rate really starts to climb. It may have taken a little bit longer in California for us to get into that high increased part of the infestation, but we really got into it in 2017, and even just this year, since the year began, we've got 199 new positive trees, and if you extrapolate that out, that's about 1,200 a year, whereas last year was only 300. If we keep at this current rate, it'll be a lot more. So the program is obviously very big financially, but the thing we've been trying to prevent for a long, long time is actually occurring more frequently, and that's HLB positive trees. This is an example of the HLB quarantine area where it exists in overlapping LA and Orange County, and the little bitty satellite infestation in Riverside County that overlaps into San Bernardino County. The green are the actual treatment areas. And we currently have about almost 90,000 residential properties in our HLB treatment areas. And that's gone up almost 9 times as much as we had this time last year. So 2017 was not a good, well, it's good if you want to ensure that you're finding it, but it's, it's not good from the perspective of this is a lot more work than it was just this time a year ago. And what happens when we find a tree is we'll remove that tree. And it's non-negotiable. It's mandatory to have that tree removed. We get a lot of cooperation, but when you have 88,000 properties, 1 or 2% of residents are refused, that still becomes a very big number. So the outreach is extremely important. We'll also do a treatment within 800 meters. Well, first we survey every property within 800 meters of a detection. Has to be surveyed to determine if there's citrus trees on the property, and then to inspect and take a sample of the citrus trees. And then we'll do a treatment out to 800 meters to knock down the Asian citrus psyllid populations in and around that area. So it's a very, very intensive protocol whenever we find a positive tree. in order to find a positive tree, you have to send a sample to our lab, or the Citrus Research Board has a laboratory. So it's talking about industry and their forethought. They saw this coming. They saw how this worked in other countries, and they knew that in order to find HOB, you have to have the laboratory capacity to run enough samples to be able to detect it with a high enough probability that you're finding the majority of infected trees. So our sample load has gone up quite a bit over the last couple years, but we're also trying to expand and diversify the number of labs that we have working on this. We work cooperatively with the University of Arizona. They process some of our psyllid samples, and now we're also bringing on the agency formerly called the Central California TriState Agency. They got a new name, I can't remember what it is, but we're working with them as well. So they'll run some of our Asian citrus psyllid samples to try and get as many samples processed as we possibly can. But it's a huge, huge workload, 140,000 a year. We probably need to do a little more to increase our laboratory capacity because everything begins and ends with diagnostics. If you can't run as many samples as you need to, then you're limiting your ability to actually find the disease. But it's been a huge and increasing workload. And because the program has gotten to the size that it's gotten, and the shocking reality of all of the HOB positive trees we were finding last year, I think it was time for the industry and the committee to really develop a strategic plan. Obviously, the resources and the money they would take to continue fighting this thing could just increase as exponentially as the number of trees we were finding, but there's a finite source of funding for everything in the world, and we really needed to focus on what were our priority goals, what do we really need to do, and we have a couple of different scenarios. Our best case scenario is the one we're in right now. We have 3 goals about what we really want to accomplish in the current scenario, and that's obviously keeping HOB out of commercial groves, limiting ACP from moving around the state, and the one way to do that is via quarantines, and fine-tuning the program. It's a very, very big program with a lot of moving parts. We want to make sure everything's working as efficiently as possible. But we also need to be mindful of the future and thinking about, okay, what's going to happen in these other 2 scenarios? The interim one would obviously be scenario 3, where you start to get HOB in commercial groves, but you still want to contain it, assuming it's not generally distributed throughout the state. Maybe it's more prevalent in one part of the state. You still want to contain that HOB there and continuing to limit ACP moving around the state. And then if we end up in the worst case scenario, we want to slow its spread in commercial groves. At that point, it'll be up to commercial growers to manage the disease in their groves. And we want to support long-term solutions, resistant rootstock, tolerant varieties, prolonged productivity of the groves, things to keep the industry viable. And we have a few specific activities that within each of those areas that we're focusing on. And in these first 2 potentially future scenarios, quickly detecting and eradicating disease trees is our number 1 priority. It seems like a no-brainer, but I think it needed to be stated that this is what the program should be doing, the most important thing we can be doing, and then controlling the movement of psyllids around the state. So actually finding disease, removing the trees, and quarantines are 2 of the top priorities. Suppressing psyllid populations is another one. Outreach, obviously, we're always going to have an outreach component with this program. So it's been an interesting time. We're trying to now align our budget with our strategic priorities to make sure the money that we do spend goes to the most important things. So that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, go ahead, Nancy.
Thank you very much. Very thorough. What are the symptoms of HLB?
Mottling on the leaves, but different types of mottling on either half of the leaf. There's a lot of diseases that will cause the sort of equal mottling on either side of the leaf, but this one One half of the leaf will be sort of blotchy and the other half won't be blotchy in the same spots. The name Huanglongbing is Chinese for yellow dragon. So when it gets pretty far along in the infestation in the tree, the shoots will start to turn yellow. Okay, then there's also the impact to the fruit. It will become small and misshapen. So if you peel an orange, the mid-rib through the fruit will be warped. One side of the fruit will be bigger than the other. But before it gets to that point, it's probably started to taste very sour. So sour fruit, misshapen fruit, mottled leaves, and yellow shoots on the tree. And then they start to sort of lose their leaves and look generally unhealthy. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, you survey, once you find an infected tree, you survey it out 800 meters. How are you doing that? You're doing that physically, or you have drones, or how do you do that? I mean, you have a lot of.
Yeah, we physically, we send staff to each house, each residential property, and look in the front yard and the backyard, examine every tree for symptoms. And if we see symptoms or if there's Asian citrus psyllid on the plant, we'll collect the Asian citrus psyllid, because you can actually detect the disease in the psyllid if they've picked it up from the tree. Or if we see symptomatic leaves, collect a sample of the leaf, but every property within 800 meters.
And do you have to get permission from the landowner?
We generally operate with the permission of the landowner. Sometimes they just don't respond to it. We'd leave a note on the door saying, we'll come by, we need to survey your property. 98% very cooperative. There's a few that just don't respond. Call those no contacts, and others actually actively resist our efforts. Say, no, you're not coming on my property. And there's a wide variety of reasons for those 2% why they just don't cooperate. Some just don't like government. Others just don't believe that there's an actual problem. So it's a whole bunch of issues. But yes, mandatory that we go on your property and survey your property.
So even though they don't want you to.
And even if they don't want us to, we get a warrant. Compel them to allow us access. We don't like to have to do that. It's very, very time consuming. It's very intrusive. We try to use as many ways to get to yes as we possibly can. Work with the local county ag commissioners. If they don't trust the people from the state, well, here's your local county ag commissioner to explain to you why this is a good thing and why you should let us on your property.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Just with my local lens, is there any coordination partnership with the local vector controls?
Well, we certainly educate them about what our activities are, but we're at the point where it's not really a management activity for a vector control agency. The area-wide issue is the biocontrol agent. So it's out there tamping down on the vector while we speak. So there's really, it's our control program. It just keeps on going, keeps on plugging away. If we're not actively doing a treatment or anything like that, it's always out there suppressing the populations, which is kind of what a vector control agency would be. So ours is just flying around out there for free. Well, free to homeowners.
Nick, I had a question. Are there any other hosts for the Asian citrus psyllid?
There are a few related horticultural species like Mariah. It's not a real popular plant here in California, but it is a very common plant in Florida. And actually it played a very significant role in the spread of Asian citrus psyllid in Florida because people grow it like a hedge in their yard. It's very, very rare to find it here. And
could you talk a little bit about what's happened in Florida or Brazil, wherever this disease has really taken hold?
It's immediately impacted commercial citrus. Florida, their situation was a little bit different. They came off a multi-year fight against citrus canker that they had unfortunately just lost. They found ACP and decided that they didn't have the energy to fight both battles, and they really couldn't do much about ACP because all of Florida is, there's very few natural barriers to the movement. They have hurricanes. So as soon as they got ACP, it just got blown from one end of the state to the other by a series of hurricanes. So there wasn't really much they could have done. They could have potentially ensured that it didn't get into nursery stock and vector the disease into nursery stock, because then it's a guaranteed way to move the disease around. But it went straight from getting the bug, then getting the disease, and because of their landscape, it just went everywhere. They didn't really, we didn't do as much as we're doing in California. And we thank them for teaching us a lesson that we don't want to replicate, but we're empathetic with the status that their industry is rapidly getting to the point where they don't have enough infrastructure to, enough fruit production to keep it going. So it's had a major, major impact on them. Brazil, I'm not as familiar with Brazil. I think Mr. Gordon's been there a couple times, and he could probably give you a much better update on what has happened in Brazil. But, we have a very, very engaged industry. Many of these people on our board and even, just independent entities have taken trips to these countries to see what's happened. And it's informed the activities that they're implementing here. Because what I didn't mention is, there's a $41 million budget for the program, but the growers are spending their own money on other ways to combat the psyllid and detect the disease on their own premises. And that's sort of the hidden cost of this pest and disease complex, is what they're spending to protect themselves, not just what they assess themselves to pay for the public fight against both of these two. So.
Yep, go ahead, Bryce.
Does this affect all types of citrus?
Yes.
And is it also in Texas and Arizona and in Mexico?
The ACP and HLB are in Texas, and the ACP is in Arizona, but they haven't found the disease in Arizona. But the disease has been detected fairly close to the border, on our southern border with Mexico.
I appreciate the scenario 1, scenario 2, and potential scenario 3.
Okay.
Ultimately, is the fix to this eradication, or is it improved stock, or is it both?
Resistant varieties, figuring out how to get more production capacity out of your grove once the disease is endemic, finding it faster. Our detection capabilities for this are pretty poor. You got to take a lot of samples in order to find that infected tree. The disease is differentially distributed throughout the tree, so if you were just unlucky enough not to pick the right leaf off the right branch, you didn't find that the tree was infested when it actually was. So spending a lot of money trying to figure out ways to detect it earlier in the infection cycle to help rogue out trees, either for the eradication program or for when growers are managing in their own groves. They're going to need to catch it before it's had a chance to spread throughout the grove. So, but ultimately, resistant rootstocks and there's other things that I think I mentioned in the previous slide as to what the research activities are to try and allow the industry to survive with the disease in their midst, which hasn't been the case in many places around the world. Industries either had to move out or become, significantly reduced.
Is it going to move further north, or is it too cold to continue to move further north?
The bug and the disease can live wherever citrus lives. Interestingly, knocking on wood here, it's been many, many months, because we had it all the way up into Placer County. We had a pretty good infestation in Stockton, and over the last couple months, we haven't seen nearly as many ACPs as we were seeing this time last year and within a year and a half. So it's sort of like the tide swept north, and then for whatever reason, maybe it was the tarping regulation, or maybe it was a cold, wet winter, sort of pushed it back a little bit and lowered the populations. And we're even seeing lowered populations in Southern California. So that maybe more about what the environment did to the psyllid population. But as soon as you have a couple of dry years and the climate is conducive, the populations could go right back up. But basically, wherever citrus can live, the bug and the disease can live.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Nick. right, our final speaker on this panel will be Roger Spencer, and he's going to be discussing the Pierce's Disease Control Program.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Roger Spencer. I'm the current branch chief for the Pierce's Disease Control Program. Hopefully everybody that enjoys California wines, table grapes, and raisins can have some measure of appreciation for the successes of this program. Back in 1999, this is a look of Temecula, and these vines were not dormant, they were dead. They were waiting for them to come back into production. And this is what we were facing. Over the 1990s, during that decade, the glassy-winged sharpshooter, which is an invasive species to California, but it's not an invasive species to the United States. It's in the southern states of the United States, but it hadn't built up to great populations, and it wasn't in areas of great wine-producing areas. But when it got to California, it built up to such high populations, it spread a bacterium, and I'll talk about that, the Xylella fastidiosa, and you see a cross-section of the vascular system of a grapevine. That those rods of bacterium, they clog the vascular system and they produce a symptom called Pierce's disease. It's vectored by the mouth parts of this insect, the glassy-winged sharpshooter. So our mission is to minimize the statewide impact of Pierce's disease in California, contain the spread of new vectors, and allow time for solutions to develop. So you see the host triangle, or the disease triangle down there in the lower portion of that slide. You have the hosts, which are grapes, grapevines, the pathogens, Xylella fastidiosa, and the vector is the glassy-winged sharpshooter. Our program, I'm going to only talk about the program aspects. Afterwards, when you come back from your break for lunch, you're going to have a panel here to talk about the activities of the PD-GWIS board and what they're doing with research. But our program components include containment, contain the spread, statewide survey, rapid response, public outreach, research, and there's a couple other activities that we also do, biocontrol and area-wide projects. And I'll speak more on each one of those. We're a cooperative program. We engage with the USDA. Thank you, Helene. Beth Stone-Smith with the USDA. CDFA, of course. Our county agricultural commissioners, they're the boots on the ground doing most of the work for this program. We have 49 contracts with our agricultural commissioners throughout the state. University of California does a whole lot of research for us. Industry groups, stakeholders, and the public was very instrumental. And I'll tell you more about the public in a little bit. So going on to containment, we want to prevent the GWIS from moving to new areas of the state. It's heavily infested in Southern California, and that's where most of the nursery production of plant stock occurs, is in Southern California. We regulate also the bulk citrus movement from one area to another. And at one time, we used to regulate the movement of bulk grapes. We did inspections on the platforms at a lot of the wineries. We did not find any glassy-winged sharpshooters in those loads, so we just continued regulating it. It's still in the books as part of our regulations, though. Statewide survey, we use a yellow panel sticky trap, and it's this color that attracts the glassy-winged sharpshooter. It's got some sticky goo on it, and we place those out in urban areas. We also use those in area-wide situations as well. We have approximately 33,000 traps in nurseries and urban situations during the peak season. We don't use those traps all year round because there's a portion of the year that's very cold and the insect is not very active when it gets down below 65 degrees. So we come out in May through October and trap all of the urbanized areas in Northern California to make sure it hasn't spread to those areas as well. When we do, you see one of our CCC members in there doing a visual inspection in some of the host crops. Rapid response. This is a treatment activity. Whenever we do find it in Northern California or areas not known to have the glassy-winged sharpshooter, we put out a gob of traps, maybe sometimes 100 per square mile in new areas. We regulate all of the activities of nursery stock going out of the area. We apply chemical treatments, and we monitor with those delimitation traps to see that we're not having any more populations. We've eradicated the glassy-winged sharpshooter in 18 infestations throughout Northern California during the term of our program since 2000. So we've had infestations in Contra Costa County, Butte County, Santa Clara County, Fresno County's eradicated some. We've had infestations in Tulare. And we've actually had 3 infestations in Sacramento County that have been eradicated. Public outreach. It was interesting to me that the Agricultural Commissioner of Fresno County, Jerry Prieto, once confessed in a meeting that the public found the first 6 glassy-winged sharpshooters in his counties, and before his paid biologist could find one. So public outreach works very effectively. We had a lot of news coverage. All the major television stations had us on, but we had meetings, we had brochures, but informing the public and bringing them up to an awareness level really is very beneficial. Some of these posters you see, California Sharpshooter Rain, this is a public outreach campaign in Napa County. They spend a lot of dollars on their public outreach in their county. Napa, as you know, the wine industry is very important in that county. Biological control, we release 7 species in 17 counties. We have 180 release sites. 2.56 million biological agents have been released. Some of the recent activities, we purchased a rearing facility in Arvin. We also help out the folks with citrus in rearing some of their biological controls in that area as well. 3 species are being released. Releases are in Fresno County, Kern, Madera, Tulare, and in Ventura counties. Area-wide projects in the San Joaquin Valley and southern counties of San Joaquin Valley, you might say, Madera, Fresno, Tulare, Kern counties, we have area-wide projects, and basically what we're trying to do is keep down the natural spread of this insect. We place traps on a quarter-mile grid, and we monitor those traps. When we get a hot spot, we have treatment coordinators who will go out and talk to those growers in the affected areas. They'll have them treat, and then we reimburse them for the cost of the insecticide. So we keep the populations in check and keep it from moving naturally. The artificial spread into urbanized areas, we have the survey and detection program that I talked about earlier. Area-wide projects in the trapping, as you can see in the year 2001, when we first began that trapping, approached about 150,000 trapped insects that year. As we applied our treatments, the USDA really got on this early and lowered the numbers 2002 to minimal amounts. You can see in the years 2012 and 2015, we had some spikes there. We're investigating that with some research right now to find out that maybe we're having some insecticidal resistance going on. We've done some other strategies as far as timing in 2016 and 17 that have lowered those trap levels. The glassy-winged sharpshooter in California in 2002, you can see it was up in Butte, it was in Sacramento County, Santa Clara County, Tulare, Fresno. It's totally infested in Southern California. There's been 18 eradications, and so now Santa Clara County had 4 infestations, the most recent being declared eradicated in the past few months. So we give kudos to Santa Clara County for keeping the hope and faith and getting it done. Great production in California, as you can see in 1998. These are in tons, and as you can see, the amount of tons of wine, table, and raisin has not declined during the span of our program. It's actually increased slightly. So we think this program has been very successful. It's been a model for other programs that have come along later on, and we're going to keep up the good battle. Any questions?
I have one, just because I know there are people listening, and we just throw this term out, biological agents, which sounds pretty evil to me, but biological controls. And I think it's just a fascinating part of our programs, how we go about identifying that that other pest that's actually the good guy doing this. And I think that's very informative for why we just don't have a shelf of the bugs ready already when we have a new program.
It is very interesting, and I think that's a fascinating part of our program. We send scientists to all parts of the world to find out where this bug exists in and throughout the world, and find out what keeps it at low-level populations in its natural environment. We'll then bring those predators back, rear it out, and then release it upon it, and it works very well.
Yeah. Go ahead, Andy.
Right. Now, we pick it up in certain retail or wholesale nurseries that bring stock up from Southern California. We have incidences there, and we've had a few nurseries that we've had to treat as a result of that, but we haven't had any incipient infestations in the Central Coast. So they remain free.
Anyone else?
Thank you
Well,
very
very
much.
good. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
the work you do for us. Do we have any other questions for the panelists? All right, we want to thank you. We're going to take a 30-minute lunch break. Speakers are invited to join us for lunch in the room off to the left. So we're taking our break. Thank you.